The fourth approach to quality requirements are outcome performance measures. Here, the idea is that qualifying programs must achieve certain direct measures of performance. Two direct measures of performance to be specific. First, that programs achieve adequate graduation and placement rates. The threshold being considered is that 70% of those who enroll in the program complete it, and 70% of those who complete the program get placed into jobs. The second major outcome performance measure being considered are earnings requirements, and there are several being considered here. First, it's important to note that there is a new federal rule going into place that were Workforce Pell legislation to pass would apply to them. So this is going into effect in any event. And if so, these programs then would first have to demonstrate that graduates' payments on loans taken out for the program are no more than 8% of annual earnings or 20% of their earnings that are above 150% of poverty level. Second, that at least half of the program's graduates must have higher earnings than the median earnings of 25 to 34-year-old high school students in their state. So above and beyond the gainful employment rule that's going into effect in any event, here are the two additional earnings requirements being considered. The first one is a requirement that earnings increase by more than the program cost. Here the logic is these programs will cost the students so much even after the Pell Grant will only cover a portion of it, and they need to get earnings requirements enough to have justified the program's costs. The higher the cost of the program, then the higher the earnings requirement should be, is the logic. The second additional earnings requirement is that earnings be more than the students made before the program. And here the idea is what we really care about is increasing Americans' earnings requirements, and whether they're starting at a lower or higher level, that as a result of the program, those earnings should have increased. The case that is made for this approach of outcome performance requirements really centers on that this is the whole objective of the legislation, is to place more Americans into higher earning jobs, and that if a program can meet those kinds of requirements, then the other kinds of requirements are really beside the point and irrelevant, or worse, that they create burdens on the programs that don't really get to the heart of what we want to achieve with them. So they suggest it will be easier for programs to comply with a more limited set of outcome performance requirements than all of the administrative criteria and others, for example. And so since that's what we really want, shouldn't we focus on that? For those who are arguing against performance requirements, they really fall into two contradictory camps. One camp that argues that these outcome performance requirements are too high, and the other camp that they're too low. For those that argue that they're too high, they point out that we've already got the gainful employment rule coming into effect, and that if you go much beyond the gainful employment rule, you may have an unintended consequence that the people that we want to help most with Pell Grants are hurt by it, because programs may not want to accept students who they think will be higher to get to those thresholds, students who are already lower income or women or people of color. And so they say this is counter to what we're, the people that we're really trying to help most with these programs. Opponents of the outcome performance requirement that think that they're too stringent, what's being considered, also point to an Urban Institute study that found that only 20% of current workforce programs would meet the earnings requirement, that the earnings are enough to justify the cost of the program. And so they say that demonstrates that these thresholds are really too high. They also argue a fairness point when they say, look, you're making these too stringent when these requirements are higher than requirements we put on colleges a college degree, which costs more and takes more time. So it's really unfair to put these kinds of requirements on cheaper and shorter programs. For the opposite camp, who think that the requirements are too low, they simply point out that since these are the objectives, it's appropriate to be stringent on these points, and particularly that we want to be mindful for these students, especially that are often lower income or people of color or women, that we don't leave them worse off than they were because they pay for a program, can't get a higher paying job, and then are saddled with student debt that they can't afford to repay.